We do live in a world where good news is hard to come by. Or so it may seem. We open the newspaper and we read of violence, of shooting, of wars, today of bomb blasts in Sri Lanka. We flip on the TV and we see fiery flames engulfing churches, grand cathedrals, and humble sanctuaries. We look at our electronic devices and see the faces of children who are hungry or abused or just plain sad, and we long for resurrection. We live in a world where hope is hard to come by, or so it seems. At times, the global chaos gets us down, and we wonder how we have failed as human beings. But I think sometimes the personal crises we fail are even harder to take. A dear one dies of cancer. We become aware of abuse or bullying. Family relations are strained for any number of reasons. And so we feel overwhelmed and helpless, and we long for resurrection. We live also in a world where truth seems hard to come by, doesn't it? We're no longer certain about what's right and what's wrong, about what to believe, about who to believe, because everyone has their spin on things. And all of us do tend to listen to the voices that make most sense to us, that confirm our own feelings and opinions. And we realize that there is no longer, if there ever was, one clear way of viewing the world, but many, not one narrative that shapes reality for everyone. And so at times we feel lost or confused or uncertain, and we long for resurrection. But this is Easter Sunday, and we are here together, and we are singing God's praises. We are ready to celebrate, and we have heard again this stunning story that shapes our faith as Christians. This unexpected, yes, unbelievable, uncanny story that I think helps us make sense of every other story. Luke tells it very simply. At dawn, the women went to the tomb. Their task was clear. They would anoint the body of their friend who had died a violent death. As soon as the Sabbath was over, as soon as the sun came up, they were there to perform an act of love, which was also a religious ritual. Luke tells us that the grave was already open, that the stone was rolled aside, and so they went in. And the body of Jesus was not there. Luke says they were perplexed. Who wouldn't be? Suddenly, it says, two men appeared. Were they angels? Maybe. They were dazzling, it says. And it says the women were terrified. Who wouldn't be, right? I actually find the emotions of these women very believable, don't you? First confused and then frightened. These angelic characters spoke, reminding these faithful women of Jesus' own words. As Luke tells the story, this is the turning point, because they remembered, yes they did, that Jesus had predicted his own death and resurrection, and it hadn't really made sense at the time, but now It literally dawned on them. Their only reaction was to go and tell the disciples what they had seen and heard, to bear witness. But the fact that the disciples considered their story an idle tale also makes perfect sense, doesn't it? These were crazy, hysterical women, after all, or so some of the disciples might have thought. They are grief-stricken. They're not thinking clearly. This is wishful thinking. Actually, my lexicon called this idle tale nonsense or twaddle. I love that, twaddle. Peter, good old Peter, runs to the tomb to see for himself, and Luke says only that he went home amazed, stunned, wondering, marveling. Yes, some of us need hard, cold facts before we believe something. And some of us make sense of things by feelings and intuition. We are all different. But this story, this light-filled story, I think can help us find good news and hope, and yes, even truth. The Easter story is the story of a turnaround, of bad news turning into good news, of hope against hope, and of truth that is stranger than fiction. Yes, the story is hard to believe at first. It is an old, old story, a miraculous story, but it is, for us as Christians, the defining story that helps us make sense of all the other resurrection stories that we encounter and hear and experience day by day in our lives. Long before Jesus lived, the prophet Isaiah painted a picture of a new creation, a vision of shalom to come. And the prophet spoke for God and proclaimed the good news, the hopeful news that God is at work, even now, creating a new heaven and a new earth, recreating, renewing, even replacing what is broken, what is wounded, and not working in our world. So in the face of global warming, Isaiah speaks of healing and renewal. In the face of war and violence, Isaiah speaks of peace and reconciliation. In the face of human failure, Isaiah speaks of forgiveness and goodwill. This week we watched a grand cathedral burn, Notre Dame, a holy sanctuary where Christians have worshiped for centuries. The edifice is a sign of human faith and creativity, and our hearts broke when the steeple fell. But we also heard Christians singing and praying outside the church, and we saw the firefighters bravely working to save this treasure. And afterwards, we heard of generous funding and plans for restoration and rebuilding. A story of resurrection, yes. But perhaps you also heard the very good news that 180,000 honeybees that lived atop the cathedral survived the blaze. They were dazed by the smoke, and so they stayed in their hives, and the beekeepers have confirmed that they are alive and well. See what I am creating, says Isaiah on behalf of God, our Creator. Shalom is surely coming. Believe it. Peter, too, is utterly changed by the Easter story. Peter, who betrayed Christ 3 times. Peter, who stumbled and bumbled at times, but whose faith rose again and again. Peter, the rock, the one who ran to the tomb and came to believe the witness of the women. Peter, in Acts, is preaching good news, an inclusive, all-embracing gospel. There is nothing here that says Jesus is the only way, only that Jesus has the power to forgive, to save, to renew, to reconcile. There is nothing here that says God's love is only for Christians or only for Jews, but that God's love is impartial, unbiased, all-embracing. In a world where hope is hard to come by, in a world where truth is hard to come by, in a world full of bad news, Peter's witness is good news. Because the Easter story changed those women forever, and it changed Peter forever, and it has turned things around again and again when it is told with love and compassion, with hope and humility. My friends, we are Easter people. This story, this good news, this hope-filled story, this idle tale that turns out to be true, is the story that gives meaning to every other story, that makes sense of all the stories of our lives. Jesus' resurrection helps us to hear the good news beneath and behind and beyond the stories of human failure and tragedy. Jesus' resurrection helps us to see the light and the goodness that humans can embody, that people like us can bear into the world. Jesus' resurrection reminds us that despite human brokenness, we are all capable of faithfulness and compassion and courage. Jesus' resurrection reminds us that we too can bear witness to the hope that is in us, to the love of God for each and for all. Jesus' resurrection shows us that our hopes and visions can be revived and renewed even in the face of deep loss and sadness. Easter means hoping against hope that love and new beginnings will arise. And Jesus' resurrection is a lens, a window, a reality that enables us to make sense of all the conflicting, competing half-truths and falsehoods that spin their way into our lives. The Easter story moors us, it tethers us to the central mystery of our faith. Love is stronger than death. God so loves the world. Do you believe this? If so, say Alleluia. Alleluia. Alleluia.